And that is a nice segue, thank you for that, into the hormone phase. So you're an expert when it comes to hormone health, hormone regulation, and I'd like to sort of pair up the cutting phase with the hormone knowledge that you have. So maybe, how do I want to attack it? I kind of want to attack it two pieces. So like, what does it require from your hormones in order to have a, for want of a better word, good cutting phase, trying to be smart, but a good cutting phase. And then also the second part, what hormonal damage can potentially be done by not doing it well. So the first part, where do your hormones need to be in order to have a productive cutting phase?
So we need to make sure your insulin is sensitized, right? And there are some really key ways to sensitize your insulin. Now, I've alluded to these throughout what we've talked about, and it just really, when you start to realize that the pieces of the puzzle that come together are actually really simple, sometimes it's like, it takes some of the overwhelm out, but it also removes a lot of the excuses, and then people go, oh, okay, maybe I can really do this.
Yeah.
And so when we think about insulin sensitivity, one of the key things you can do is eat more protein and lift some heavy weights, right? So those are the things that are going to resensitize your insulin. Another thing that can be great is after a meal, going for a light walk, 20 to 30 minutes, it starts to enhance that glucose uptake, that blood sugar uptake, and regulate things from there. Now, if we've gotten to a point where we have overridden our hunger cues and we are suppressing our appetite constantly and just eating, we've maybe overeaten in the past, you may have done some damage to what we call our hunger and fullness hormones, so your ghrelin and your leptin, and that can create something called your leptin resistance. And so sometimes it's a matter of retraining that as well. So it will be learning to stop when you're about 80% full, even though you may not feel like you want to stop eating, and teaching the body that it's okay to be slightly hungry and reigniting that fire or that metabolism again, because that's often part of the problem. It's like, oh, well, I'm eating till I'm full or I'm eating till I'm comfortable, but you've overtrained some of your hormone, or you've switched off some of your hormones that are teaching you to stop eating. So there's that component to it as well, and making sure your body is resensitizing itself. So that would be probably the bigger hormone components. Then you've also got to make sure you're checking your thyroid. Like sometimes people automatically can't lose weight because their thyroid is out of balance, whether that's too overactive and they're losing weight too rapidly, or it's too underactive and they're not able to lose weight at all.
Yeah, I'd like to deep dive into each one of those if you want. And the leptin and ghrelin, it's so interesting that you mentioned that, because when it comes to intuitive eating, not that I want to get into these odds right now, just a little side note, when it comes to intuitive eating, if that isn't regulated and you're eating in accordance to that, it's technically not actually what your body wants, because you technically don't actually want to or need to eat, even though you feel hungry. But maybe we'll get to that in a second. The first one you mentioned, insulin.
Yeah.
What is so important about having our insulin at a healthy balance? And maybe actually a step before that, what is insulin responsible for in the body when it comes to consuming foods and wanting to lose body fat?
So insulin is a storage hormone. So you eat a meal. Let's say it's chicken, rice, and broccoli for the sake of making this easy.
Yum.
The great thing about that is you've paired carbs, proteins, hopefully some fats in the oil that you potentially cooked it in, and you got some greens there, right? That is going to slow down the insulin spike. But when food comes into the body, insulin is secreted from the pancreas. That causes bad blood sugar to rise. It also is paired with cortisol, and that goes up as well. Now, the body is looking to maintain a stable blood sugar level the entire time that you're existing, right? As soon as you put food in, your blood sugar is going to go up. So insulin's job is to keep it at a really stable level. So it goes, okay, blood sugar's gone up. Let me make sure I take anything excess, right, as a storage hormone and put it into wherever it needs to go. Maybe it's after exercise, great meal. We're going to put some back in our muscles. We're going to replenish what we used from the liver. Okay, we're overeating or over-consuming, or the blood sugar's gone up too high because maybe we didn't have chicken, rice, and broccoli. Maybe instead we just had a packet of chips and the blood sugar shot right through the roof. So what does it do? Oh, it's gone well above the threshold. I'm going to take that and I'm going to store it in the fat cells because my muscle fibers, so my muscle stores of glycogen are full, my liver stores of glycogen are full. What do I do with this? I'm going to convert that blood sugar into fat and store it on the body. So that's really how insulin works. And over time, if you continue to eat, and it doesn't even necessarily need to be processed foods, or I hate using the word bad foods, but those foods that don't actually serve and support our body in high quantities. This can be eating those naked carbohydrates that we talked about last time, and too much of those. And that's going to constantly push that insulin up. And the more your body has to secrete insulin, the more often it does, it starts to, again, lose its sensitization to it. So it thinks it needs more and more and more. And so that's where we start to develop that insulin resistance. And then people go, well, why can't I lose weight? Well, because you're not sensitive to the insulin. The insulin is like the key to the cell to unlock, to store things in the right place. So does that make sense?
Yep. No, that makes perfect sense. Yeah. It's just such an interesting system within the body. And when we think of weight loss, so often it's just calories in, calories out. And that is the fundamentals of it. But like you say, if your insulin isn't within balance, then your body isn't going to be, maybe it's best described as efficient as losing weight. Like the furnace or the way it can burn isn't as efficient as it could be.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, the other thing you got to look at too is, like I was talking to a colleague the other day, and they were saying it was ridiculous. They did a massive hike throughout all of New Zealand, right? That top to tail, burning about 6,000 calories a day, eating about 1,500. He's like, I thought I'd be shredded by the end of it. And I wasn't. I still had that little pouch on my belly. And it's like, yeah, so it's not just down to calories in, calories out. The body is always going to hold on to what it thinks it needs for survival. It comes down to that fight or flight response. And you do go into famine mode when you're in a calorie deficit. It's just making sure you support your body through that.
Yeah, exactly. And moving on to the leptin and ghrelin, could you explain those a little bit further and sort of how we relate it to the intuitive eating piece, and how intuitive eating is a really good thing to do for your body, but how maybe sometimes in relation to these two hormones, I don't know, they might confuse what you think is your intuitive sense when it's actually not what your body wants.
Yeah, so ghrelin is your hunger hormone. It's the, when you get that little gurgly sensation in your tummy, or you're like, oh, I'm kind of hungry now. So that's ghrelin. And that's what you almost want to listen for when you are intuitively eating. However, if we are thinking about that fight or flight response and we're constantly stressed, your ghrelin is going to be suppressed. That's why I get, clients come in, they're like, yeah, I could easily go for hours without eating. And I'm like, okay, do not ever understand that concept.
Yeah.
But it's because their ghrelin is being suppressed, their cortisol is probably too high, and their body is being told that it doesn't really need food right now. It's primarily focused on keeping itself alive, right? And so there's the potential for the ghrelin to be suppressed. The other thing I'll mention here is that there's a huge difference between hunger and appetite. And so ghrelin can come online when you're actually truly hungry. But appetite can trigger that false sense of hunger because you may smell the food. Have you ever watched TV and been like, oh, that looks really nice. Yeah. I'm all of a sudden hungry. Even though you've had dinner, you are sitting there fully satisfied. And you're like, I could probably go for some dessert now that I've seen that on the TV, right? You've seen it. Maybe you've smelt it. Someone's like cooking something and you've finished your meal for the day. Taste. So this is, everyone's like, oh, I've got a dessert stomach. I've got a second stomach for dessert. When you change the taste of something, or if you get the taste for something you like and you're like, oh, well, I'll probably just like some potato chips or something like that. They're moreish. Once you start, you want more. It's not that you're actually hungry, but your appetite is there. And so that's another thing that can be really hard and really confusing when it comes to intuitive eating, because you're not actually relying on your ghrelin. You're utilizing our appetite as per se. And so then when we train our bodies to rely on our appetite, we can suppress that leptin and we can override that. So whether that's making sure we complete a meal even when we're full, whether that is over consuming food in general, whether that is having high processed foods. If you, for example, you're eating a Big Mac, so high in calories, but it's such a small little thing, you
Yep.
don't quite associate it in the right way in the body. So you can easily overeat because it's also not going to fill you up and satisfy you in a way that if you had made a homemade burger, it would. And so it's that leptin resistance, just like I was talking about the insulin resistance, that can develop, and our body starts to override those internal cues saying, hey, I've had enough, I'm full, it's registered in the belly, stop eating now. It's like, oh, what else can I have? Because you've actually shut off the feedback loop. You've shut off the biochemical pathway, the mechanism in your body to tell you that you're full. And that's where it can make intuitive eating really, really hard.
To me, it almost sounds like it's the dopamine system that's overriding it.
Mm.
Do you think that's what it could be?
I would actually have to look into that. That's a
I,
really good,
it just feels like it.
yeah,
If you think about having
reward.
ice cream, for instance, yeah, you're like, yeah, I'd love an ice cream. You imagine yourself having the ice cream, then you have the ice cream, you're like, yeah, this feels good. And that's almost what it sounds like, because you wouldn't, I mean, you might, but you probably wouldn't be like, oh man, I feel like a boiled potato right now. Like, yeah, I would love to have a boiled potato. It just doesn't really do it. Where I think it's like the dopamine. It feels like it's almost the reward system that it's leveraging.
Mhm.
That's just kind of what it feels like. What do you think?
Yeah, it can definitely be driven by that reward center and that pleasure center. And I find a lot of people will gravitate towards something like chocolate or ice cream from the sense of magnesium and calmness that it can give you as well. So we've got to think about what's also driving this on a deeper level. Are we led towards the sugar because we're actually overstressed and our magnesium is shot and we need to actually just top up our magnesium levels? Or are we craving, like you say, something that is not really going to serve us versus, I remember, parents always used to be like, well, if you're still hungry, you can have an apple. If you're not hungry for the apple, you're not
Yes.
hungry. And it's like, it's so true. But
Yeah.
when you're an adult, you don't have that level of parenting in there to
You
be
can do whatever you want.
and so we override it. It's that high. And if you think about dopamine versus serotonin, serotonin is our long lasting hormone. It is that fulfillment. It's that feeling that you get when you give someone a gift or you do something for someone and it lights you up inside. Whereas as dopamine is a very short, quick fix. It's that quick firing. There's a lot less receptors of the dopamine in the brain. And that's going to be like, oh, we want more, we want more. And nowadays, there are so many chemicals in the food that know exactly how to target those dopamine receptors to encourage you to want more, suppress that leptin, and overeat as well. So we're dealing with
Yeah.
so much here.
Yeah, and I just haven't heard it that separation between appetite and hunger. I've never really heard it described that way, but intuitively you can sense the difference, right? Exactly
Mhm.
like when you finish your big roast chicken or something, I don't know, and you're super full. So intuitively you're not hungry, but your appetite for a cheesecake, I,
Yeah.
I mean, yeah, I got an appetite for a cheesecake, so that's really interesting. And then there are a couple of other hormones you mentioned there. Maybe I will drill into the cortisol a little bit because you
Mm.
touched on that there. And I've done a couple of bodybuilding shows. My partner Chloe, she's a pro
Oh.
IFBB athlete, and she's done way more than I have. And cortisol is always something, especially when it comes to bodybuilding. Obviously, you're
Mhm.
wanting to get super shredded. So like I have, through my own experience and vicariously through others, learned a bit about how cortisol can act on the body while cutting. But could you maybe explain it a little bit further and why it's important to keep our cortisol levels at a good I don't want to say low because I don't know if it's ever possible for to always have low cortisol levels, but to keep them at a reasonable level throughout a cutting phase.
And you actually don't want your cortisol levels to be low either. You want them to be balanced.
Yeah.
'Cause low cortisol is actually very similar symptomology to high cortisol, right? We get to
Hmm.
the point where we crash and we burn. And so you just want to be operating predominantly out of that parasympathetic state. So your rest and digest, your reproduction, and your repair. And so if you are doing something like a show, you and I'm sure they stress this to you if you had a coach, the rest is just as important because you're hitting the gym twice a day, if not 3 times a day. You're doing double cardio sessions to get on stage. And this is very different to what you would be saying to people like Gen Pop that are just wanting to shift some weight, right? You're trying to get down. Like I know one of the guys that I used to see at the gym all the time, like he got down to 2% body fat when he stepped on stage. Like that is a very, very different level of training that it takes to get to that point. And so you want to make sure that you are resting and recovering so that the body can repair and you aren't going to have those high levels of cortisol because you are putting copious amounts of stress. You're stressing it out in the famine response. You're stressing it out by exercising potentially 3 times a day. You're stressing it out through the fact that there is this nervousness in terms of prepping towards a show. And so it is, sounds ridiculously simple, but coming back to things like your breath, making sure you're getting probably more sleep than you normally would so that you're giving your body optimal time to recover. You're upping your magnesium. You'd know the importance of protein during this time because protein's not just there for making sure you have the muscle mass. It's a huge part of your recovery phase as well. And so when we think about the impact that cortisol can have, it's really just trying to keep the body safe. And so if you can constantly communicate to the body that you're safe, and I think, if we think about way back when I was at uni, and it was like bodybuilding was such a big thing then. And everyone was like, oh, you have 5 to 6 small meals a day. In some way, that also supports that cortisol level because the body's going, oh, there's food coming in, there's food coming in, there's food coming in. There's a level of safety. So it's when we go prolonged periods without food that's going to shove that cortisol level right up to the sky, that's going to shunt the insulin up super high, and it's going to cause more fat storage. So there is actually a method to the madness of having, walk around with those giant lunchbox things with about 6 different Tupperware containers in them, because you're not eating every 2 hours, but you are eating every 3 to 4 to keep teaching the body that it's safe enough and that there's food coming in, and that calms the body and the cortisol levels down as well.
So would you say the main piece when it comes to struggling to shift fat and having high cortisol levels is because it increases the amount of insulin? Is that the main piece there?
And also just the level, if the body doesn't feel safe, so if we think back to the caveman days, if the body doesn't feel safe, that thinks that there is a famine going on in the world, it is going to hold on to weight as fat store. Like it's going to store fat because it's like, well, I don't know when he or she's going to feed me again. We just need to make sure that there's little fat stores there because we may have to get through a winter. Think about a bear hibernating, right? They don't eat for how long because they've got so much fat that they store. We can't go and do that, but it's a similar kind of mechanism because our body is like, well, this famine could last 2 to 3 weeks. We're not actually that far out from when that was actually a thing. And our brains haven't caught up with that yet. And so when we start to understand that concept, it isn't aware that there's a supermarket 5 minutes down the road and you can go and stuff your face with as much food as possible when you get home, right? It doesn't understand that concept because it's got so many years and years and decades and centuries of programming. And so it does really come back to making sure the body knows that it's safe, making sure we're optimizing digestion, and then not, I guess, overeating so the insulin then ends up storing a whole lot of stuff.
Yeah. And the other one you mentioned there, which sounds very important, was the thyroid. And the thyroid is actually something that I don't know a whole heap about. Like I might have listened to a couple of podcasts or something on it, so maybe some bits and pieces, but it's definitely not something I've deep dived into. So I'd be quite interested to hear how it sort of works in the body and its importance in the fat loss phase. So could you speak to it, and if it's not working how it should, what the negative impacts could be in relation to us losing body fat?
I mean, more often than not, you're going to see someone who has hypothyroidism. And so hypo, low, slow. That's the easiest way to remember it. I always liken it to a sloth. Hyperactive. It's fast-paced. I think about the cheetah. Right? So if you think about those 2 animals, it starts to make things a little bit easier for the brain to grasp. And we're thinking more predominantly around this fat loss piece. I'll focus on that hypothyroidism, which is more and more prevalent in today's world, today's society, because some of the key nutrients that actually support our thyroid health are missing from our soils. And so if it's not enough soil, it's not enough food. And that can slow down weight loss. That is why we're seeing so many people struggle with weight loss as well now. So the thyroid is a little butterfly gland in your neck, and that is what is doing plays a huge role in regulating your metabolism. Now, if your thyroid levels aren't optimized, it's going to slow down your metabolism. It's also going to slow a lot of other things down, right? It'll slow down hair growth. It will slow down your body's ability to even clear your bowels effectively. Like if you think about slow, like what does that look like in the body? And so obviously weight gain is going to be one of the biggest things. We think about the flip side of that, we're going to see things like anxiety. So if you've got the slow metabolism, you may also experiencing things like depression. It's that low mood, low kind of everything, and the body isn't working for you. And so when it comes to thyroid health, one of the first things I do with all my clients is actually do a complete blood panel, because at least then we can see, is their thyroid going to be playing a role in this weight loss component? Do we have to do something to reset the thyroid to get it back into playing the game it needs to be playing? I actually had someone on the podcast that I did, and she used to do bodybuilding shows, and it got to the point for her where she was not losing weight. The weight was climbing, and she had to see 7 doctors before someone was like, oh, maybe it's your thyroid. And she went down this
Wow.
massive rabbit hole, now specializes as a functional doctor in thyroid health, quite an incredible human. But it just goes to show that, again, that calories in, calories out isn't going to be everything. If you've got something at the root cause that is driving your body to hold on to weight, because maybe you have done, excessive weight loss before and you've damaged your metabolism or your thyroid. Maybe you are eating too little and that's telling your body or your thyroid, hey, actually slow down that metabolism. We're burning too rapidly. Again, we're protecting our body from potential famine. We need to hold on to more weight. So it all kind of ties in together. Does that make sense?
Yeah. That's super interesting. And maybe diving more into the thyroid, if someone does have slow thyroid, hypo,
Mhm.
what are some ways of getting it back online and speeding it back up a little bit?
So one of the biggest things you want to do is make sure that your body is converting the inactive thyroid hormone, so T4, to T3, which is your active thyroid hormone. Then it can do its job with the TSH, which is your thyroid stimulating hormone, and that's what's going to regulate your metabolism. So again, I'll quite often test all 3 of those on a thyroid panel to make sure everything's working effectively. But there are key nutrients that your body needs to make sure that the thyroid can do its job effectively. So we've got iron, iodine, selenium, and zinc. Those are the 4 key nutrients that your body needs. Now, we don't get enough iodine in our soil. We don't get enough selenium in our soil. We certainly don't get enough zinc. And so what I'll often see is, especially if you think about athletes or people that train a lot, especially females, because we're losing blood every month, is their iron levels can be all over the place. A lot of anemia can go on, and that can cause the thyroid to be up. If we're looking at males, the thyroid can be thrown out by high levels of iron, because I often see these high levels of inflammation in the body. So your ferritin's really high. That's going to cause the thyroid to go out. And so it's fine tuning this balance. We used to, in New Zealand, like have the little white and blue iodized table salt that would sit, for what you'd put on your
Yes.
meal. And everyone has moved to this pink Himalayan rock salt, right?
Yeah.
That has no iodine in it.
Interesting.
And so we're actually not getting the nutrients that we need. Now, the iodine in the iodized table salt still isn't the best form, but it was better than the pink Himalayan rock salt, which has no iodine in it at all. I recommend something like kelp salt, because kelp is naturally super, super high in iodine. And so that, I think it's a teaspoon of that across all your meals per day will get your recommended daily intake right there. So it's a very easy way to put the nutrient back into your food, to put the iodine into your diet without necessarily doing any harm or anything like that. I know a lot of people are afraid of salt, but salt is actually incredible for you. It's one of your electrolytes. You need it.
Yes.
Things like selenium, 2 Brazil nuts a day. Very, very easy to do through food. Like, I'm always a food first approach. If we need the supplement, we can, but it's actually safer for us to get things like iodine and selenium through food than it is through a supplement, because if we're dealing with a thyroid issue, it can start to throw things out. So again, safety first always. And then you do want to check your iron, because you never want to supplement if your iron's too high. That can cause a whole host of issues. And then the zinc. The zinc is one of the ones that I will supplement with, because unless you're eating a bucket of oysters every single day, you're probably
Yeah.
not mixing your zinc into. Yeah, no, it'd be delicious, but most of us can't do that.
Expensive.
Very expensive. So that's another thing you want to be adding in. And then on the flip side of that, those are the nutrients you need to make the thyroid work. Gluten is the nutrient that can, I guess you can call it a nutrient. I don't know. I wouldn't
Yeah.
that can stop the thyroid from working effectively, because it actually competes for the receptors on the thyroid gland and can block the uptake of those thyroid hormones, and therefore cause a whole host of issues. So when we are dealing with people who've got autoimmune, like Hashimoto's, gluten's a no-no for the rest of their life because of the impact it can have.
Wow, I never knew the thyroid was such a complex thing. Like, I suppose I knew of it, but didn't know how deep it can get in.